Hi and welcome people to my program today. The essence of our program today is all about debt management. And if you're wondering why we've got this program, it's actually in response to a lot of our young viewers who regularly post stuff on my Facebook, and we're asking about credit files, credit scoring, and all of those kind of questions. Now, if you guys want to go into business, one of the first things you need to look at is actually your credit history. And if there's anything like a bankruptcy order or any payments that you've missed, then it's going to be near mission impossible for you to have any loans, any credit for when you set up in business. So today's program is actually to give you loads and loads of advice of what you need to do prior to thinking about going into business. And one of the first port of calls is actually looking again at your credit file. So in the studios today, we have Amer Ikram, who is from Islamic Debt Solutions. And we're actually going to ask what the question is: why is debt associated with Islam, and why his company is actually called Islamic Debt Solutions. But as a backdrop to this, just to let you guys know that around 50 companies per day are going into liquidation, which is another technical phrase of phrasing bankruptcy, or they've gone bust, or whichever is a better word that anybody feels comfortable with. But 50 companies a day going bust is a mighty big figure, and I'm sure none of you sat at home would want to be included in those figures. And also about 41,000 people were made bankrupt last year, and those bankruptcy orders are absolutely horrendous. The implications from that, people, you need to have a serious think about whether anybody would want to go down that road. But also in terms of our young viewers, before you start getting yourselves into any trouble with late payments, missed payments, or anything of the sort, you really need to listen to some really sound advice here. So I'd like to introduce Amer and welcome him to the show.
So,
Well, Raxlam, how are you today?
everything's fine. Yeah.
Thank you for coming into the studio. And first off, what is your role and what is your company about?
Founded the company some 2 years ago, and my role is mainly marketing. And in terms of why it's called Islamic Debt Solutions, we set up a conventional debt management company called Simply Debt Solutions first. I was researching for content on debt and interest issues. If I just go a little bit sort of into my background, born and bred here in this country, at a young age going to mosques, you weren't really taught the religion. You were taught how to read the Quran in Arabic, a language which you didn't understand, and that was about it back then, in the mid-1970s. So the Islamic knowledge really wasn't there. When I finished university in 1993, I decided to go into financial services. Mm-hmm. I had concerns about interest issues at the time, and went to see a scholar here in Manchester, who at that time gave me the impression that if it's an interest-based loan, if it's for your main residence and it's your one and only debt, it's okay. That was the impression he gave me.
Can we just tell our viewers, what do we mean by interest? Well, what is interest?
Interest refers to any increase in monies paid back. So you're borrowing X. If you're just paying back X, if let's say you're borrowing £100 and you're paying back £100, well, you're just paying back the principal being the original amount of money borrowed. Interest, any amount over and above the original, say, £100 that you've borrowed, it doesn't matter what the amount is, that would be classed as interest. Or more so in Islam, the Arabic term is Riba, which means an increase in simple terms. So that's interest, and it's not just a prohibition in Islam, it's a prohibition in all the Abrahamic religions. Mm-hmm. Many other religions have rulings against interest, and you have civilizations dating back to 2,500 BC. The Babylonian and Mesopotamian civilizations were talking about interest. Greek philosophers in 500 BC were talking about interest.
So why have all religions across the centuries banned interest? What is so bad about interest? Because surely people who lend money need to make money. Otherwise, why would they want to lend? Is there a commercial angle on this?
part of the issue with interest is that if interest is introduced into the system, it allows those with money to generate a risk-free return on their money without risking their original money lent. Mm-hmm. That's the crux of the matter, and what it causes over time is inequality in income and wealth in society. So as an extreme, we're seeing that now in America. Mm-hmm. And obviously with over the last sort of year and a half or so where we've had Occupation Wall Street mm-hmm. protests going on, a lot of that has, some of those protests has been using this term of the 99% and the 1%. And that's what it's referring to, that tiny 1% of the population is wealthy and is getting wealthier, and the poor are locked into permanent poverty.
But surely, I mean, we also have quite a large religious-based viewership. Okay. And I'm sure some of them really can't understand what the association with debt and religion is. So religion has banned interest because yes. it creates inequalities. Is that what we're...
Yes.
Is that the main reason?
That's one,
because
that's
in Islam,
one of the reasons, yes.
It's prohibited quite drastically, isn't it?
The prohibition in Islam is one of the most severe. And beyond shirk, which is disbelief, this...
Which ranks number one, people.
Which ranks number one. And now, beyond that, interest or riba, prohibition of riba, and being involved in riba, a lot of a lot of Islamic scholars rank interest, riba, as number two in severity. So, unlike alcohol and pork, which, if you look around the community as a whole, the Muslim community, most Muslims will keep away from alcohol and pork. Yet, when it comes to the prohibition of interest, riba, or usury is another term, most people dive in head first without any thought process. And part of that is there is no teaching taking place. There was certainly wasn't in my generation, and in a lot of cases there still isn't. That teaching still isn't taking place.
How would people borrow money, especially, say, for example, the banks or any other financial institution where say for a typical example, your mortgage is based on interest. You have interest only, then you have the repayment, which is part interest, yes. part loan repayment. But any form like credit cards, anywhere where you need to borrow money, any form of credit actually involves some kind of interest. Okay. So what would people do?
It doesn't always. You have, even within the current sort of monetary system, you do have, for example, venture capitalists. So, to put it in simple terms, you have programs on TV like Dragon's Den, where you've got a panel of people with money, and then others are coming in, showcasing business ideas. So one party has a business idea, and the other party has the money. And what needs to take place is a marriage between the two. Now, in that system, interest doesn't necessarily need to enter into that arrangement. What would happen is the person with the money would be an equity stakeholder in the business. So what they would say, if you came to me with a business idea and I thought it was viable, what I could say to you in return is, okay, I will take an equity, a share in your business. I'll take a share in your business. We will say, for example, I will have a 40% share. And this is what you see, for example, in Dragon's Den. They're always, on most occasions, they're always haggling over the percentages. And this is what they're haggling over. What percentage of the business is each party going to be owning? And then, once the business is established and up and running, if there's a profit, we share the profit in that percentage. If there's a loss, you share the loss. Now, the key point there is, by having that type of system, the person with the money is sharing in any profit and any potential loss. And from an Islamic perspective then, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has then, he can then sort of decide which ventures are successful and which aren't. And that way, the business community, wealth within the community is dynamic. It's moving. This movement of wealth, because that person today who's wealthy could be involved in a business venture which completely collapses and he loses all his wealth.
But what we're trying to get to the bottom of
Yes.
today is there are lots of debt management companies.
Yes.
So why does yours say Islamic debt solutions? What
The-
is unique about your company that
So
you call it Islamic?
So just going back to the issue of having set up a mainstream debt management company, as I was researching, there was so much content from an Islamic perspective, which for me personally was an eye-opener. My background had been as a financial advisor since leaving university in 1993, so sort of 16, 17 years as a financial advisor. When I'm reading some of the hadith, some of the texts within the Quran into Baqarah relating to interest, a lot of it was a complete eye-opener for me. So I'll give you one example. One of the hadith in Islam relates to the fact that Riba, interest, is of 72 different levels. The least sinful level, the least important level, is the equivalent of a person having a relationship with their mother. Now that's severe. Within the Quran itself, the relevant verses in Surah Baqarah are verses approximately from 275 to 280, and within those verses it's clearly stated that there is a prohibition on dealings with interest, with riba, and if people do not give up their dealings in riba, this is the equivalent of waging war with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet, peace be upon him. So it's expressed in extremely severe terms. Now that research for me was an eye-opener. So I did not want to sort of take this on board and just keep it to myself. It was a case of we need to get the message out there to others. My background in financial services, I knew most people aren't aware of this. I wasn't aware of the severity of the ruling myself. And the reason for having Islamic Debt Solutions as a sort of a name was, yes, we do get involved in sort of debt management solutions and options that every other company out there has, but we're talking about it from an Islamic perspective. We're trying to increase the awareness and people's knowledge on the prohibition of riba. That's a large part of my work.
So once they've come to you and you've advised on some kind of debt management plan, because of the Islamic perspective, that would then hopefully stop them from entering into high interest related.
Not high interest, any interest.
Any interest related products or services in the future.
It's a case of hopefully, inshallah, for them not to be involved again, but equally a lot of people we're dealing with have children, have teenage children, or children who are slightly older, just started their first job, they're in their 20s. And one thing I always try and emphasize is, take a note of our website. There's certain leaflets we have. Make sure you do take time out. Try and educate yourself. These are just signposts. Go away and try and do your own study. I'm no scholar at the end of the day, but I can point you in the right direction and educate yourself. That's all I've been trying to do. And more importantly, the next generation, your children, or if you've got grandchildren, try and educate them if they're at that sort of stage, whether in their teens or they've just started their first sort of part-time job while still at school and so on. Educate them on these issues, because children across the board are not being taught about finance, about money management in schools. There are moves afoot to try and bring that into schools, but at the moment there really isn't much going on generally.
Okay. For people that are watching this program, I mean, the UK is regulated in a very different way to, like, say, some other countries in the world. So in terms of like debt, bankruptcy, debt management plans, this is for UK people, for UK businesses. It's individuals, if they unfortunately, should they go down that road, are affected by bankruptcy. But for all of you today, this program is primarily for those that are looking to set up in business, and also for individuals such as sole traders, to get a better understanding of debt management, because at some moment in time, every business faces difficulties. So Amer, if a business is facing difficulties, what should they do? Financial difficulties.
Financial difficulties, I mean, it's a matter of talking to to someone. A lot of the time when we're dealing with people, they've buried their head in the sand. They've not really discussed the issues with anyone, even their accountant, their spouse, and they've just tried to handle it. And it is very, very difficult. If you've got yourself into a lot of debt, it's a difficult topic to...
It's easily done, isn't it? Your suppliers haven't paid you on time, perhaps for goods that you've delivered. Some of your customers haven't paid, and before you know it, you've got lots of debt and no way of paying it.
True.
So how would debt management come in?
Our work is generally with individuals. We don't tend not to deal that much with businesses. Complex business issues we will sort of refer on to business specialists.
That people will be a totally separate program. This is, like I said, about sole traders, because again, sole traders would be in business, and it's only a single individual that can be made bankrupt or be referred to your organisation. Usually companies are liquidated and there's assets and there's receivership and other people that get involved. So that would be a totally separate program. But I wanted to touch upon this simply because we have a very young viewership who asks a lot of questions about how they go about setting up a business. And some of them even find that they can't even get a mobile phone on contract. And that is usually their first financial dealing, transaction with the outside world, and that's when they get referred to go to a credit reference agency, find out what's going on your credit file. And it's very, very important to look into this before you go into business. Now, should there be mispayments, and as I understand, for around 6 years, they can't really...
Adverse credit, once it's registered in the UK, stays on your file for 6 years, generally speaking. If there's no dispute and you have genuinely defaulted on payments, it will stay on there for 6 years. It's a bit like a conveyor belt, a 6-year conveyor belt. Your adverse credit will end up on the conveyor belt. It will carry on for 6 years and automatically rolls off. It's not something you have to apply to be taken off. But for those 6 years, generally, especially in the current climate, people will have difficulty trying to get any sort of, if not necessarily borrowings, then even opening up a bank account just to do basic day-to-day transactions like paying their bills or having some sort of transactional card, a debit card.
Some of our young people don't actually understand what bankruptcy is. Can we just talk through the implications of what bankruptcy is and what it actually involves? Because that goes beyond 6 years.
Okay. I would say for young people, it generally wouldn't affect young people. Generally, I would say. Bankruptcy is always a final resort. And if we're talking, depends on how young we're talking, if they're in their teens, I mean, obviously... if
we're talking about these young people who can't get mobile phones on contract.
There, it's going to be an issue of their credit history not being strong at that sort of, at a young age. Lending institutions want to be able to establish that this person is capable of taking on a contract, be it a mobile phone contract, and pay this on time. Now, say for example, an 18-year-old will never have entered a contract before. Such contracts can only be entered from sort of age 18 onwards. They won't have had any contract, so how can a lender or a mobile phone provider establish whether this person is a good risk? They won't be able to. And for that reason, it's far easier just to decline them.
So is it true that once you have adverse credit, especially in terms of like bankruptcy, some people's, adults especially, that your actual job might be affected? You do actually need to read your employment contract, because if you have bankruptcy, there are actually job application forms which actually say, have you ever been made bankrupt? Do you actually have to answer that question?
You would need to answer the question if it's being asked, because later the risk then is if you don't disclose at job application stage, and some employers at a later stage apply for references. They don't necessarily, in a lot of cases, apply before they take you on. They may apply sometimes later on. If they run a credit search on you later on and find there is a bankruptcy order, or there has been one in the past, you may lose your job. And certain jobs where you would be involved with monies, especially in financial services sector, becoming bankrupt it would be instant dismissal.
So why do some people struggle to open up bank accounts once they've been declared bankrupt? What goes on there?
There have been many high street lenders willing to offer basic bank accounts to bankrupts, but literally last week there seems to be a move afoot for some institutions to stop even those basic bank accounts. By basic bank accounts I mean no checkbooks, no overdraft availability. So it's a basic transactional account. A bit like a pay-as-you-go sort of, there are, I've forgotten the name of these,
okay, never mind.
top-up cards. They're almost like a mobile phone, pay-as-you-go mobile phone.
Top-up credit cards.
Yeah, which don't actually have any credit on them.
You top them up yourself,
top them
people.
up and then you can use them. But if people are not able to open up a bank account out there, there are organisations, there's one, just trying to think of the name. There are some companies offering these sort of top-up cards. So if someone can't get a bank account, even a basic bank account, there are the one I'm thinking of. There's one organisation out there called Card One Banking. That's one organisation that comes to mind. They will offer you a top-up card. Doesn't matter what your credit history is like, because there is no risk to them. It's just a basic transactional account.
So, you know, there are some debt management companies out there which claim, you know, all kinds of miraculous things. And one of the claims that they make is, you know, they can write off your debts and you have nothing to pay. Is that actually true with debt management? Can you actually do that?
It depends on which option you're talking about, because there is certain legislation, fairly recent legislation, which does allow you to do that. So, for example, you have debt relief orders. This is legislation dating back, which was introduced by the government in April 2009. So for a certain category of person where they have no property assets, less than £15,000 or less of debt, so no property assets, £15,000 or less in debt, disposable income at the end of the month of £50 or less, disposable income after deduction of all the basic living costs, whatever's left over, if that's £50 or less, total value of all their assets of no more than, I think it's either £300 or £400, and if they have a car, it can't be worth more than £1,000. Now, if they fit that sort of criteria, they pay a one-off £90 court fee. Generally, they can do this through the Citizens Advice Bureau. So a lot of the work we do, we will get in many times such inquiries. We don't deal with those. What we will do is we will run through all the criteria, try and establish whether they would qualify for a debt relief order, and then just signpost those people to the local Citizens Advice Bureau.
Okay.
We're not charging anything for that advice, and then once they've gone to visit the Citizens Advice Bureau, they can check in further detail whether that person would qualify, and then they would pay the fee via the Citizens Advice Bureau, a one-off fee of £90. Wait 12 months. In 12 months' time, their situation would be reassessed, and if they're in the same position, then there's a 100% write-off of the debt.
And who makes that decision? Citizens Advice?
They would. We don't, like I said, we don't really deal with debt relief orders at all. It's not something. We just signpost people to the Citizens Advice Bureau. So if people wanted further details, I'd suggest the best people to approach is the local Citizens Advice Bureau office. They could get far more information from them in terms of sort of detailed.
So what kind of typical customers do you have and clients, and what are their typical kind of problems that they have, and how do you help them?
The bulk of the problems are credit cards. Credit cards, overdrafts, loans, and the scale of the credit card problems, I think most people don't appreciate how vast the credit card industry is globally. There are some stats I was reading in an article. The article wasn't about the credit card industry, it was about the mailing industry in America. And it mentioned in there that in the third quarter 2010, so this is sort of in the middle of the credit crunch, which started in 2008. Third quarter 2010, so this is a 3-month period. Over a 3-month period, the credit card industry in the US, not the UK, in the US had mailed out something like 2.1 billion pre-approved credit card applications.
Oh my goodness.
2.1 billion. Now the population of the US is some 360 million. And it mentioned in the article that this 2.1 billion of mailings was at a much reduced level because of the credit crunch. And a lot of credit card companies weren't looking to expand their business. They were being cautious. And that during the boom, in the run-up to the credit crunch in 2008, you were looking at 6 to 7 billion a quarter. So 2 billion mailings a month were going out.
Okay.
So mailings in the sense that this is a pre-approved credit card, £1,000 limit, just sign here and we'll post out a card to you. So it's easy, it has been easy debt to accumulate. There hasn't been stringent criteria to sort of qualify you for a credit card.
So what happens with the credit card? How do people actually end up in debt? Do they not make the minimum payments? Because the minimum payments is usually a very tiny amount. So are people actually struggling to make that minimum payment, and that's how they default on their credit cards?
The minimum payment depends obviously on the amount of debt on the card. I mean, a lot of cards are anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000, but some people have credit card limits of 20,000. Now, the minimum payment on a £20,000 credit card isn't going to be small. The problem that occurs in most cases is that people slowly accumulate the debt, but because of compound interest on the credit card, you can get yourself into a situation where very little of the actual money that you've borrowed is being paid off. So in many cases we routinely see credit cards with say £5,000 owing on them. The minimum payment being requested is £100 a month. Okay, that might be affordable for a lot of people, but the issue is that although the minimum payment is £100 a month, the interest being charged every month is, say, for example, £85 to £90 a month.
From that £100? From
that £100. Now, in many cases, people, I would say in the vast majority of cases, people will not look to see how much of that payment is interest. Certainly the people we're dealing with, a lot of them will not look to see how much of that payment is interest. And
does it matter though?
It matters hugely, because in many cases, if that person is, say, in their 40s, if you do the simple maths, work out what they're owing, how much their minimum payment is, how much of that is interest every month, if they continue to keep making minimum payments, they'll be in their grave before it's paid off. Okay. Mathematically, that cannot be paid off in their lifetime. It can't be done.
So are we advising people to make as a bigger amount that they can actually reasonably afford on their credit cards in order to get out of the minimum payment vicious circle as it is?
Our stance is twofold. Number one, never apply for a credit card in the first place, at all, full stop, from an Islamic perspective, because that's a big issue which a lot of people aren't aware of. The issue is a contractual issue. I speak to a lot of people that say, I don't see where the problem is with a credit card. A lot of people talk, the main talk from an Islamic perspective tends to be on mortgages. Not many people talk about credit cards, and a lot of Muslims do have credit cards. And the issue there is that a lot of people say, I have a credit card and I pay the full balance every month, and I always have done from day one. I've never ever paid a penny in interest. So how is that? Is there a problem with that? Well, the problem isn't at the point at which you've received the card and you physically have it in your possession. The problem occurred at the point at which you signed the original contract for the credit card. Because at that point in time, you signed a Riba-based contract, an interest-based
Okay, we're going to have to stop you right there. We always do that every single week. We stop at a very high point just so you guys can come back to us. We're expecting prayer time pretty soon. So shortly after the prayers being said on TV, please do join us back and we'll talk further on credit cards and all the rest of it. So join in a bit. Hi people, and welcome back, and thank you for joining us. And just to say, our program today is about debt management. Number one, we've had loads and loads of inquiries by some of our young viewers who are struggling to get a mobile phone on contract, and that is really their first financial transaction that they've had and they're experiencing difficulties, and then they're told to go and check with a credit reference agency. Secondly, as an individual, before you even start business, if you have a bad credit history, it will really seriously damage your chances in business, because at some point you're going to need to grow, and if you need to borrow money from any lending financial institution, you will seriously, again, be in lots of difficulties. So we're trying to advise you today as to what your options are prior to setting up in business if you're thinking about doing so. And also for all our young viewers who really haven't got a clue what the first thing about debt management is. So just before the break, we were talking about credit cards, and in the studio today we have Amer Ikram from Islamic Debt Solutions. And just to say that a lot of the financial institutions where you borrow money are built on interest, and the Islamic religion and also most of the world's religions are totally against any form of interest based on money. So we'll come back to the point that we were discussing before the break, and that was credit cards and minimum payments. So Amer, let's go back to the point that we were making.
So the point was one of credit cards and the sort of Islamic stance on credit cards. A lot of Muslims have them, and they do state that they pay the full balance off each month, in that way never ever incurring interest right from day one. The problem isn't what you do when you physically have possession of the card, it's what you did at the point at which you signed the contract, because you signed an interest-based contract. Now, that won't mean much to most people unless they understand the prohibition of riba, of interest in Islam. Being a very, very severe prohibition, the issue is, if you've signed that contract, you would have had to have agreed to the interest. If you crossed out the interest clause in a credit card agreement, they won't provide you with the card. You have to agree to that clause, that if you don't pay the balance off in full at the end of the month, you agree to interest being applied. Now, if you replace the interest clause to one of other prohibitions in Islam, which people tend to understand, for example, pork or alcohol prohibitions, most Muslims understand those and keep away. In general, the vast majority of the community keep away from those prohibitions. So, for example, if in that credit card agreement, instead of an interest-based clause, there was a clause to state, if you don't pay off the full balance at the end of the month, you agree to drink a glass of whiskey. How many Muslims are going to sign that particular contract? Not many.
They wouldn't. Yeah.
Not many. There may be the odd one here or there, but in general, everyone would run away from such a contract. Or interest in two different hadiths is related to zina, which is extramarital affairs. Now, if there was a clause in there to state if you don't make the balance in full, pay off the balance in full, you agree to have an affair.
But isn't it really difficult for our young people, for anybody watching this program? It's a very vicious circle, because if you don't have a credit card, if you don't have a good credit history, it does affect your financial transactions in terms of like getting a mobile phone on contract. You wouldn't be able to get that.
But you don't necessarily need, what you've got to look at within Islam is that there are certain clear-cut prohibitions. You don't go near, it's not a matter of transgressing those, it's a matter of not going anywhere near them. You don't even approach those. Now, for example, it's not a matter of being stuck on and thinking, I have to have a contract mobile. Well, there are pay-as-you-go mobiles. If the contract mobile isn't accessible, then go for a pay-as-you-go.
But some of those snazzy phones are only available on contract.
But this is where materialistic society generally is thrusting these images on a daily basis through the TV, through the magazines, through media, and obviously, is it last week where you've got the launch of the iPhone 5 and people are queuing up for it and everyone's talking about it, I have to have it now, not tomorrow, it has to be in my possession today. So the materialistic society encourages consumption. In fact, there's a documentary on this issue which I uploaded to our Facebook page last night, and it's a Russian documentary, 20-odd minutes, talking about consumerism and the sort of effects that it has. And it's just a matter of coming to...
But the point is, when we talk about Sharia compliant, or we talk about Islamic debt, in essence what we're talking about is policies, products, services, whatever shape that might be, especially in terms of like financial products and services, and they are to be interest-free right across this entirety. But
True.
One of the things that I've personally found was when I was researching this whole domain of Sharia compliant policies versus the interest, products and services which are all available on the high street.
Yes.
But we find that the admin charge of the Sharia compliant policies is quite high. And it's just branded as an admin charge.
True.
And when other companies are quite obvious and straightforward, upfront to us and saying, well, this is our interest, this is our charge for lending you the money. But Sharia compliant policies have a hefty admin charge, which kind of like balances.
My stance on a lot of those products is they're not Islamic in any way, really. It's almost like a backdoor riba, backdoor interest.
I mean, that was the impression I found that.
But you do have initiatives which are genuinely, that do meet the requirements. I mean, here in Manchester, there's an organisation called Ansar Finance. They've been operating now for some 10 years, no, in fact far more than 10 years. I think it's something like 15 years they've been operating as a not-for-profit, community-based organisation where members join, they contribute towards the organisation, say for example £10 a month, and after a year's worth of contributions towards the organisation, then they are able to apply for a loan. Now this could help a lot of the youngsters, and it would keep them away from interest-based debt, because the monthly contribution to an organisation like Ansar is £10 a month. Now that's affordable by most people. But what it allows you to do is, after a 12-month period, after 12 monthly payments, you can then apply for a loan up to a maximum of £4,000. Now, for example, if you applied for a £4,000 loan through Ansar Finance, you pay back £4,000. There are no administration fees, there's no interest, there's no increase. You borrow for, you pay back for.
That sounds a little bit too good to be true. How can they afford to lend money with no well, if we're paying £10 a month, that's £120 over the year.
Yes.
So for £120 admin charge, they will borrow you for.
Well, it's not an admin charge. Everyone is continually paying into the, into the sort of fund, and the organisation is run by volunteers.
Okay.
And it's for the benefit of the community. It's a community benefiting themselves.
Okay.
You know.
Okay, let's talk about bad debt and good debt, because I'm always aware of the time on the programme and I have so many questions to ask. So there's such, with youngsters again, because we have got quite a large young population on Facebook, and they've been sending in loads of questions, and especially around student finance, good and bad debt. So that's how it's being put across to them. What are your views on student finance and good and bad debt? What's all that about?
Good or bad debt, in my view, yes, there is a distinction between good or bad debt. Good debt I would class as being able to borrow funds, for example, from family and friends, where you borrow, say for example, 1,000, you pay back 1,000.
That's always the best debt, people.
There's no harm in that, and there's nothing in Islam which prohibits that type of contributions, because there is no increase there. There is no prohibition of that type of borrowing taking place. The problem is going back to the interest-based debt. That's my classification of good debt and bad dett.
Yeah, but you know what it is? I mean, we live in the UK.
Yes.
And to have, I don't know, our financial transactions, in accordance with Islam in particular, isn't that near mission impossible right now? Can you actually operate your life in that way?
I would say no, because again, it would come back to what society seems to indoctrinate people into. in terms of you have to have your own house, you have to have a nice car, you have to have this, you must go on holiday regularly, and whatever. I mean, in terms of other sort of consumer gadgets, you need to have an iPad, you need to have an iPhone, you need, you know. Now, by the time you've finished trying to meet all these requirements, you will get yourself, a lot of people get themselves into debt. You either class yourself as a Muslim and abide by the rules, or you don't.
How can we inspire some of our non-Muslim viewership to abide by, you know, Islamic Sharia-based compliance?
I don't think we need to, because, for example, the rulings against interest aren't just an Islamic thing. The discussions, the initiatives, the practical solutions to a usury-free environment, these ideas are far more prevalent in the Christian community than they are in the, I would argue, than in the Muslim community. So, for example, what I mean by that, for example, there's a chap over in Ontario, in Canada, Tom Kennedy. Now, he, for the last, I think, some 2 decades, has been plugging away and talking about usury. And he runs a usury-free week. And it's heavily advertised, and they encourage you know, people to look into this concept of not having usury, not having interest in the money system.
We're running close to our time, so I want to get 2 questions in very, very quickly in the last minute and a bit. Number one is for people, because we have these questions to answer from our viewers. Thank you everybody for posting your messages on my Facebook. One was that if you have bailiffs knocking on your door, and do you not open that door, and in that case, do you run the risk of them taking your car from the outside? And is that they don't open the door on the first visit or subsequent visits? How does that work? That's question number one. And question number 2 is if anybody's struggling with any form of debt, what should they do? If we take those last 2 answers, and I think that's about all we're going to have time for.
Bailiffs, to have got to the stage where bailiffs are knocking on your door, generally speaking, that person's buried their head in the sand and not gone out there to try and look for any advice.
Key one's council tax. We get a lot of those as well.
Yeah, you really don't want to mess about with council tax, because the local council can bankrupt you. And there's been cases here in Manchester where that's happened, where people have only been owing less than £2,000 and the council has bankrupted them. So, you know, these are priority debts. There's a classification of debts in terms of priority debts and non-priority things like council tax. We would class as priority. You deal with them first. At the earliest possible opportunity, you need to seek help, whether it's to companies like ourselves, to Citizens Advice Bureau, jump onto the internet, speak to somebody.
Last advice, because we're literally running on the last 10 seconds now. What would you say to our viewers who are facing difficulties?
Again, speak to somebody. Don't bury your head in the sand. The problems occur when people bury their head in the sand and don't discuss it with anyone.
Okay, people, I think time just flew by on this show, as it always does. If you have any questions relating to the program or any kind of financial difficulties, please, you can always get in touch with me through my Facebook, and also again, Amer's Islamic Solutions Debt Company is also on Facebook. And also all you have to do is Google, you know, both of us, and you'll find our details showing up. So please, people, do make sure you watch next week's program. Because this is always a live show, it's very difficult for me to actually announce on a week-by-week basis who will be appearing on next week's show, even though I already do know, because they're already pre-booked, because anything can happen during the week. So therefore, I don't actually announce that. But do watch next week's show, because again, we'll be taking this program one stage further, and hopefully, you know, fingers crossed, we'll be talking about this kind of topic all over again. So hopefully see you next week.